looking at the old law, and these are going to be subsets. The old law and the new law are going to be subsets of the divine law. And so as we move into it, I want to just begin with a quick review to kind of situate ourselves as to what we've covered thus far. So in a brief review on what law is, we learned in the definition of a law that it is an ordinance of reason, meaning it comes from reason and is reasonable. It's directed to the common good of persons living in community. It's formulated by a competent authority, meaning it is developed by someone who is indeed a just ruler or leader. So for the U.S., it comes from either the president or the legislative body or from someone who is in a competent authority. It's not just made up by someone who does not have jurisdiction. And finally, it's promulgated, meaning it's communicated effectively. A law is only a law if it can be communicated and thus followed. So a law is an ordinance of reason directed to the common good, formulated by a competent authority, and is promulgated. And we also looked at four types of law. The eternal law, as God has a design or plan for creation and then carries out that plan. The natural law, which is our intellectual interaction, our participation with that eternal law as intellectual beings. There's the human law, which for us is simply our application of the natural law to more specific circumstances. We think of examples like constitutional law in the U.S., intellectual property law, tax law, physical property law, criminal law, family law, things like that. And then finally, we have the divine law. This is bolded and underlined here because when we're talking about the old law here and in the next presentation on the new law, we are specifically in the realm of the divine law. All right, here we're talking about divine revelation. So let's get a little more specific of a review for divine law. The divine law, we need to separate it from the eternal law. I can see how those would be confused. Remember, the eternal law pertains to the natural good of creation. God created everything to behave or act or to be in a particular way, and that is its natural good. But the divine law, which comes from divine revelation, pertains to the supernatural good of man, meaning God has divinely revealed his particular law for a particular reason. His particular law is directed to the good of man, but it's a supernatural good of man, and that particular reason is that the good of man is to live eternally with him. All right, so God is revealing this law to man for his supernatural good, that is his eternal destiny, living in heaven with his Creator. Now, man needs this law for four reasons. First of all, supernatural good, which here means our supernatural destiny, heaven, requires that there be a supernatural law. There's a supernatural requirement. We have to live in a certain way in order to attain or accomplish or acquire that supernatural destiny, which is heaven. And so we can think of it in terms of there being a supernatural law that we have to follow. Now, man's judgment is uncertain because man being a creature and his supernatural good, eternity in heaven with God, being far above his intellectual capabilities, we need help. And so therefore we needed divine revelation in order to be able to make our judgments more certain. And this is made even more so by sin. Original sin has darkened man's intellectual capacities so that the divine law is absolutely necessary in order to be able to accomplish our destiny. Third, we are body-soul composites, meaning we are made up of physical material and spiritual matter, so to speak. And we are rather incompetent in judging spiritual things because the majority of our knowledge comes through the five physical senses. And so we tend to be predisposed only judging physical things as opposed to spiritual things because we experience everything through our five physical senses and our bodies. And so we needed the divine law in order to be able to judge spiritual things. And finally, the human law that we can create through our participation in the natural law and the eternal law is simply inadequate to forbid all evil And our supernatural good, our supernatural destiny, heaven, requires that all evil be forbidden, that all evil be precluded, excluded, so that only purity enters heaven. And so the divine law was absolutely necessary in order to prepare us for that. And as I said before, the divine law comes through divine revelation, meaning it's revealed to us by God in a divine way. And the primary means of divine revelation for the church has always been sacred scripture and sacred tradition. And for sacred scripture, we have the Old and the New Testaments. And so when we talk about the Old Law and the New Law, we have kind of a correspondence to the Old Testament and the New Testament of divine revelation. So let's look specifically at the Old Law. So when I reference the Old Law, what am I talking about? Well, first and foremost, think the Old Testament, right? The word testament also in Latin could be testamentum or sacramentum. Really can refer to a covenant, which is a legal action, right? So when we talk about testament, when we talk about sacramentum, when we talk about covenant, we are talking about something legal. And the Old Testament, while it is a group of books, referring to all of those books and events and revelations before Christ, is really kind of centered around one primary legal transaction in the Old Testament, and that's the Mosaic Law. That's the covenant with Moses and God, Israel and God coming out of Egypt in the book of Exodus. That happens at Mount Sinai, and this is where God gives him the famous covenant and the Ten Commandments. Okay, so the Ten Commandments is given within the Mosaic covenant of 686 or 7 commands and prohibitions, but all can be summed up in the Ten Commandments. So when we refer to the Old Law, we're really talking about either the Old Testament or the Mosaic Law, Mosaic here referring to Moses, and the Ten Commandments. So what did the Old Law do? All right. First and foremost, it reveals man's vocation, specifically his vocation as the image of God, going right back to creation. Man and woman, he created them. In the image of God, he created them. So the law really is God's first stage of revealing to man's destiny, the fact that man was created in the image of God, and therefore to live in the image of God, to live forever in the image of God. And so it really reveals man's vocation. He's called to be like God, sons and daughters of God. How is that done? That's done through love of God and love of neighbor. It's part of the first commandment, but also one of the things that was in the Old Testament was called the Shema prayer. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. So love of God, and then later on, in a similar context, love of neighbor. You cannot love God without loving neighbor. So love of God and love of neighbor is not new in the New Testament. That's in the Old Testament. And so the law that was given to Moses, the Ten Commandments, prohibited certain things. Why were so many things prohibited? Why were so many things sinful? Why is it that so many people could not do so many things? It's because these things were contrary to the love of God and to love of neighbor. Murder is obvious. Adultery is obvious. Being greedy or covetous, that's obvious. Those things are contrary to love of God and love of neighbor, and therefore they were prohibited. The law was not just a bunch of don'ts, it was a bunch of do's as well. There are certain things you needed to do so that you could not only love God, but also love neighbor. Jews were required when they were harvesting in their field, they could only make one pass. So if you imagine harvesting grain and going through the grain fields and chopping down grain and gathering it up, you could only make one pass. If you dropped anything on the ground, you were not allowed to go back and pick it up. And so the prescription was only make one pass through a field. And then the prohibition was do not go back over your fields. Why? Why can't we go back and be economical and pick up everything we dropped? Well, because everything that was dropped is for the poor, the alien, the orphans, those who do not have means for themselves and enough food. They can go through and pick up those things left behind And so it was a way to prescribe things so that you could demonstrate not only a love of God, but a love of neighbor. St. Augustine describes the old law as God wrote on the tables of the law, the tablets of the law, what men did not read in their hearts. What St. Augustine is getting at, the reason the divine law was given, the reason the Mosaic law was given was because men failed to see in the natural law, remember the natural law, men failed to see through their intellectual capacities what it meant to love God and love neighbor, so God had to show them. God had to reveal to them. Basically, what St. Augustine is saying is man should have been able to live without the old law, without the divine law. Man should have been able to live without the divine law. However, because man fails to read in nature and in his heart what he should do with reference to God and neighbor, God had to fill that void. God had to come and reveal to us exactly what is wrong and then what is right, what we should do and what we should not do. So that's what the old law did. Why is it called the old law? Well, primarily because there's a new law, all right, and we'll get to that in the next episode. So the old law, it revealed right and wrong, right? We talked about on the last slide, it prohibited what was contrary to love of God and love of neighbor, and it prescribed what was in accord or essential to love of God and love of neighbor. But there's something that the old law did not do, and that is it did not give the strength or the grace to fulfill it, right? And so the old law said, this is wrong, don't do it. Right? But as we see in the history of Israel in the Old Testament, they pretty much violated every commandment, right? If God said don't do it, more than likely Israel at some point in time did it, right? And if God said this is what you should do, at some point in time in Israel's history, they failed to do it, right? The law was kind of like is described as kind of a pedagogue or a tutor, an ancient tutor. An ancient tutor in the old world was someone who kind of was a babysitter, kind of told children not to do this and tried to get them to do that. But to be quite honest, the children were just not quite mature enough to really be able to follow the rules. And so the pedagogue or the tutor was just there to kind of keep them out of serious trouble, all right, until they could grow up enough in order to be men and women, to live virtuously and to do right and wrong as they were supposed to. That's what the old law was. It's just that it never provided the strength, or in our case, the grace to actually fulfill the law. That's why the law was constantly being broken by Israel, because they did not have the strength of the grace to fulfill it. So the old law really, it disclosed sin. It kind of identified the problem. And in that way, it prepared for the coming salvation in the new law, which is actually communicated in the prophets. The prophets were always talking about a new law that would come about. The old law is eventually fulfilled in the new law. It's not forgotten. Don't think that because we have a new law, the old law is gone completely. No, the old law is built into the new law and is fulfilled in the new law, which we will look at in the next presentation. So what does this have to do with our spiritual life, with living the life of faith? First of all, vocation, all right? The old law, the Old Testament reveals to us who we are, primarily God's image. The old law, what it communicates is good. Right? There are some portions of the old law that are really not applicable to us. A lot of the religious rites, the sacrificial rites, all of those things, how to properly sacrifice goats, that stuff doesn't apply to us. Right? The old law was also a civil law for the nation of Israel who had a king. That stuff does not apply to us. But the moral codes, a lot of the moral codes in the Old Testament Mosaic law do apply to us because they're picked up in the new law. Christ specifically references them and intensifies them. St. Paul in his letters specifically draws upon them in a lot of his moral exhortations. And so it reveals to us who we are, how we are supposed to be, how we should love God and love neighbor. At the same time, it reveals what is wrong with us. It identifies the problem. not only original sin, but also the continuance, the slavery to sin, as we see in the type of Israel coming out of Egypt, out of slavery into the Promised Land, which is really just a big example of how we come from slavery to sin to the Promised Land of heaven. And so it's really an identification of the problem. And so the struggles that Israel has in the Old Testament with being able to fulfill the law, those are the same struggles that we have in being able to rid ourselves of sin. And finally, it's a good preparation for the actual solution, all right, the new covenant in Christ. And so, as we read in the Old Testament, as we study and meditate upon the law that's there in the Old Testament, it constantly points us to the new covenant. And in fact, we kind of need to read the Old Testament in order to understand the new, because what's said in the New Testament uses the same language, uses the same images. The idea of Christ dying on the cross as a sacrifice makes no sense to us unless we understand what the old law said about sacrificial offerings in the temple. All right, you can't understand what Christ did on the cross unless you understand what priests were doing in the temple by sacrificing pigeons and doves and goats and lambs. And so it's kind of a preparation for us to better understand what is taking place in the new law. So this is just a quick expose on the old law, and in the next episode we're going to be looking at the new law.